Smooth with Tim. They had you rolling like you popped the pill. Once you hear the show, you ain't gonna want it to end. Get creative with the sounds you can make with your mouth. Reaching all over the world, Queen Silvy in the house. Award-winning show with the #1 spot. Look out. It's the Queen Silvy Show. 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 Welcome to
Hi, this is Joe Mass. You are listening to the Queen Silvy Show. You are now part of the royalty.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, coming to you live from the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, it's time for the silky smooth sounds of Smooth Tim and Her Majesty herself, Queen Silvy.
Hey, good morning. This is Smooth Tim, and welcome to another feature-packed episode of the Queen Silvy Show. It is now my absolute pleasure to introduce to you everyone's favorite comedian, the sexy Queen Silvy.
Yes, he said it, not me. Yes. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world today. Thank you for tuning in, watching, and listening to the Queen Silvy Show. You got time to get some water and spread the word. Right now, we're currently live on all of your social media platforms. And Smooth, how are you today?
I'm doing wonderful, Queen, and might I ask how you're doing?
I am, as always, supercalifragilistic.
Expialidocious,
That's
I
right.
suppose, is Queen Silvy. That's 24/7, 365. You are
I
simply
know.
amazing. Yes, you are.
Well, we're going to call it like it is. But what also amazing smooth is the amazing lineup of guests and announcements that we have on the show today. Don't we?
On today's show, Queen, we have coming up first, church coach consultant Lee Powell.
Yes.
And a little part two of the show, which will be at noon, we'll have Tobias Cook. Tobias is a producer, songwriter. You're going to love his music, and he'll be on part two at 12 noon.
All right.
As far as we got some announcements, also, don't forget, if you like monthly giveaway, the Queen Silvy Friends Club, The Queen Silvy Show. Get yourself signed up, and we've got some goodies that we'd like to give away.
Oh, yes, we do.
Yes, we do. Also, let's not forget to give a shout out to everybody out there still that's following us on the various websites, Twitter, Instagram,
Shout out.
TikTok, everything. Thank you. And that helps keep you up to date with exactly what we're doing. And we want you to continue following us and enjoying this programming.
Absolutely.
That's about it at the moment, Queen.
Well, you know what? Our hearts and prayers go out to a good friend of mine who lost her mom, Sean Ray Price, Dupree Owens. Our hearts and prayers and condolences goes out to you, as well as our hearts and prayers for anyone who is suffering through this pandemic or going through something personal. We pray and for you for recovery and strength through all of this. We're going to get through this. I know that we are. And before I begin, also, I want to give a shout out to the United Kingdom, to Spain, London, the Netherlands, the Kingdom of Tonga, Johannesburg, South Africa, and now Uganda.
Thank you for
Shout
tuning
out.
into the show.
Absolutely. I appreciate
Isn't that
it.
nice?
Yes.
All over the
indeed.
world.
I love all over the world. We all have to get along, don't we? And our first
Eventually.
guest, yeah. Well, we know our first guest when he comes on to the show. We're going to be talking about what are we going to be talking about?
The church and the community.
That's right. We're going to be talking about the churches and the community. And before we do that, what I'd like to do at this moment is, and keeping it short, sweet, and authentic, I'd like to share some motivational words from the Queen Silvy Show to you. If people are doubting how far you can go so far that you can't even hear them anymore. Got that? Focus on your potential instead of any limitations and be the best version of you. I believe in you. And those are some motivational words from the Queen. Thank you. Oh, this audience. I love a fully charged audience. I'm telling you.
Don't you though?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. Spread the word. We are live right now on all of your social media platforms. The Queen Silvy Show. We are going to get our conversation on with my first guest in part one of the Queen Silvy Show. Over 25 years growing his church from 30 to 9,000 weekly attendees with 5 locations. Now, a church coach and consultant, helping churches maximize their kingdom impact. And he's here today to discuss the church's role within the community. From Fort Worth, Texas, I introduce to you Lee Powell. Hey, Lee. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you.
Lee Powell was formerly on the show a couple times, great times. And simply go to your favorite podcast, type in the Queen Silvy Show, and go down to February 25th. That's when he was first on the show, 2020 of this year. And last on the show, September 15th of this year. And there are good conversations. Get yourself caught up. Go to the first one where we talked about Lee and the work that he does with the churches. And then we talked about this pandemic and how to keep the faith and have fun during this pandemic. So Lee,
I enjoyed that.
Wasn't that great?
That was a good one.
It was great. I got Tim into doing art now. Got a good idea for him to keep himself busy. So you know how to stay busy in this here time right now. So Lee, we're going to be talking about the community, right?
Yeah, and the role of the church in the community and the world, really.
Right. But you know what? I believe that the church's role within the community first begins with the church's role within their own congregation. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. But I think where it really all begins, if you go back 2,000 plus years and you take the words of Jesus,
Yes.
and that's where we get that's the genesis of the purpose of the church.
Okay. And the purpose of the church is what?
Well, Jesus made it pretty clear. His final words, his dying words, you could say, when he said to the disciples, "Go and make disciples." So, as I have done to you, really do unto others. And making disciples is literally converts, making people go, bringing people to a place of no faith to Christ, to faith in Christ, and then maturing in that faith. That's really the role of the church, the fundamental role of the church. And then a lot comes out of that.
Yeah, because I was going to say, is it one of those things where it's easier said than done?
Well, yeah. I mean, when we started Cedar Creek, our heartbeat was to reach people with the gospel. That is to make disciples, to take people who were far from God or people who were really just didn't even have a sense they were lost. I mean, there's a lot of people walking around in the world today who have no sense of their disconnectedness from God. And so the role of the church really is to awaken them to that by the power of the Holy Spirit, and then bring them along in their faith. And then that faith journey includes certainly impacting our communities. I mean, if I say the way we change the world is one person at a time, and it's really not I don't mean to, I'm not making that statement just because others have made it. It's true.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we started Cedar Creek, the idea was not to reach thousands, but was to reach one person at a time. And then that person reaches somebody, and then it just kind of has this multiplying effect. And that's really what happened some 2,000 years ago. And then today, it started with a group of 12, you could say. Cedar Creek started with a group of 30, as you'd already mentioned, and then it's in the thousands now. And there are a lot of stories of churches that have done the same. But fundamentally, the church is really not about, people think the church is primarily about serving the poor and things like that. Those things are very, very important, but they come out of a person whose heart has changed and been changed by the power of God and by hearing the message of Christ and responding to the message.
Well, we are having it's just getting started with Lee Powell. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for Lee Powell, Smooth Tim, or myself, you're more than welcome. Wherever you're listening to this right now, simply leave it in the comment section. Smooth Tim will get these questions over to Lee. Lee, you are absolutely correct, and like I said in the first time when you was on the show, when you talked a little bit about that, kind of go back and refresh, if you will, from when you started. You started in this building, and you brought in new believers, and
Yeah.
then you transferred. Tell me just briefly that story. You went from here to,
Yeah,
and how
so
did you
we
do it?
actually, so I'd been in the marketplace actually. I was on a marketing staff for a Fortune 500 company, but felt called into ministry. And so really felt God was calling my wife and I to start a church where I grew up, Perrysburg, Ohio. And so that's what we did. We took a group of, well, by that time I was an associate pastor at a church of about 500. And I asked permission of that church to take a group of people. We did, group of 30 people. We started at our first meetings were at the Holiday Inn French Quarter in Perrysburg, Ohio, and actually a Holiday Inn that is now rubble.
Hmm.
I don't know if you've seen it.
No,
It's
I
so where
haven't.
we started our church is now just a parking lot. And then we moved from there to a junior high school. From a junior high school, we built our first building. Then we ran out of room there and decided to start more locations. And so when I left Cedar Creek because of the Parkinson's diagnosis in 2014, I left in 2015. There were about 9,000 people with 6 locations. And so
Wow.
started with this group of 30, but the whole time our intention was never to be a big church. We really didn't have our sights set on that. I had no experience doing anything with a big church.
He had plans for you.
It sort of happened.
Yeah.
And of course, there was a time at which where I felt like, gosh, I'm not leading this thing. I'm just kind of following God's prompting, so to speak. And not that there weren't leadership principles and all of those things that I could talk about that I think that lent themselves to what happened there. But again, the thing that really drove the church, the growth of the church, I would say is um, this commitment to reaching people for Christ first and foremost. Because Jesus even said himself, he says, "I came to seek and save the lost." And when he made this statement in a context where there's this guy who was saying to him, "Hey, Jesus, I'd follow you, but I got to go, bury my father. Basically, take care of something very important." Jesus said, "Let the dead bury the dead," which sounds insulting.
Hmm.
Didn't mean to be insulting the guy. He was just basically saying, "I came to seek and save the lost. You do your thing, go right ahead, but I know why I came." And so as a church, Cedar Creek, we knew why we existed. We existed to help people who didn't know Christ come to faith in Christ. And then again, out of that came these really following uh, the teachings of Jesus to love others even more than ourselves. And so the community impact comes out of these people who have changed hearts.
Okay. Is that, hold on. That says Hannah. Yeah. Okay. So listen. I feel what you're saying, but I'm gonna flip it just for a second and take
Sure.
it to your where you're doing now. You're coaching churches,
Yeah.
and you're a consultant to these churches.
Yes.
Now, taking that right now, we have this pandemic going on. I want to
Yeah.
state that businesses, bars, and restaurants are not the only ones that's affected
Sure.
of this pandemic, and that there are church homes, church
Yeah.
members that is stressed on this. As a coach and as a consultant, Lee, what would you say right now to some churches in order to keep their members as well as gain some new membership,
Well, that's
like
really,
right now?
yeah, it's really touchy because you have this whole, I deal with different churches that are approaching it differently. Some are saying, we're not going back until January, you know, public services.
Mm-hmm.
Others are saying, we're going back now. And I know one church, which I'll leave unnamed, where the pastor puts on the sign out front, masks not required. So he's kind of has a little rebellious spirit in him. And I don't mean that demeaningly. I'm just saying he basically says, hey, you don't need a mask. And his church is growing, strangely enough. Now, there are other churches that are saying, like at Cedar Creek, their decision was hey, we're going to come together and worship, but We're going to all wear masks. And their attendance is only about 25% of what it has been. And that's basically around the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Churches that are back and up and running they're only about on average 25 to 30%, unless they do something radical like this one guy, that I told you about. That's sort of he's reaching this group of people who are kind of have this attitude about masks, kind of anti-mask attitude. So what I say to the pastors is I say, look, I don't decide. I can't tell you how God is speaking to this church, your church. I mean, I don't speak for God. I mean, but I am a leader and I have some experience. And so I think the best choice to make is I think churches should try to go back and be open to the public and just follow the community guidelines. There's one case in California, a guy named John MacArthur. I don't know if you've heard of this. In California, their rules are so strict that it ended up his people just started coming. He said he really wasn't saying, "Hey, we want to fill the church," but their church has nearly full. Well, the state of California came after them, and the state of California actually was giving them a lease on some land to park in, like a 100-year lease. Well, they're taking that away from the church.
Wow.
Yeah, and so I look at that and I go, wow, the government is way overstepping it there. On the other hand, I think some of the churches that are ignoring, trying to, that are being sort of rebellious and not sort of going along with at least the standard of social distancing and wearing masks, that makes no sense to me, because to me, it's a bad testimony. And I've told them that.
Smooth.
This kind of ties into one of the viewers' questions, Lee. It said, since COVID, I have not been to my church home, and Sundays haven't been the same since. The general question is, with worship online, do we really need a church building?
Wow.
That's a great question.
Wow. That's really is a great question. Thank you. It's
a great question. And the answer to that is yes, the church will always gather. And even though online, I'm so grateful that, that we have the ability now. I mean, imagine if there were no online services right now, but there are. And so, in the very early church was not building centric. The very early church, Christians, you became a Christian and actually you would be in a home group, so to speak, a home church where people could gather, maybe 10, 15, 20, 30 people. And that was the church. But then what happened is there were large gatherings because people would gather in the temple courts in mass in the temple courts and hear teaching. And so large gatherings and medium gatherings and small gatherings, I mean, they're all good. But what I say is this, that there's something that you cannot duplicate via online that the building experience provides. And that is people standing shoulder to shoulder, singing their hearts out to God. In fact, one passage in the Bible actually says, don't forsake gathering together. In other words, gather together to encourage one another towards love and good deeds. Can you do that online? Yes, you can. But, it's like watch these television shows, whether it's America's Got Talent or The Voice or whatever, and they have now this wall of people's faces, which is cool. But come on, it's not the same. It is not the same as a crowd of 3,000 people cheering, and so
they have to adapt. I mean, there's a little bit of transitioning going on to, with all of this here, just like the transition with the mask. You get some who just like don't want to, freedom of speech. They don't want to, and they don't care. And the same thing here. And there are churches before this pandemic that was already doing online services.
Yes.
And the reason for that is to like with today's times now, the internet, kids and the phones, all this stuff is an end thing. So we got to reach and we got to get the word out to them somehow. So it was a benefit even before the pandemic to do the online. Now it's even more necessity because churches are all closed and we still need to bring in anymore. That is the big challenge right now. Just like a business wants to get customers.
Yeah, so what a lot of the churches already also had small groups in place. These groups of where you have, sometimes it would be a group, an affinity group. So you might have a singles group, married couples,
right?
And, family groups, whatever. But the idea was breaking these groups into smaller you're breaking the large church, the mass of people, into smaller groups so you have a relationship and you know people. And it's those groups, honestly, that we used to call them at Cedar Creek tiny little churches, TLCs. And we'd tell the people lead them, we'd say, you're really the pastor for this person in their life. So it's you who should be praying for these individuals, caring for them. And so that's one strategy, is if churches don't have small groups, people should be gathering together in these smaller groups.
I agree.
But again, that the larger groups, the mass of people, you just cannot duplicate that online. And so the person who is saying, hey, maybe we don't need buildings, I would say it's not an either or. We need buildings, and we still need people gathering in small groups, and we still need the online.
And that ties into almost another question that got asked.
Wow.
It is from Bill. And Bill asked, how do you define sin, and how would you help someone who has sinned?
How do I define sin? Well, that's a great question. It's interesting.
Wow, you guys
We've gone from talking about masks and the so this is interesting. So in this Garden of Eden, we go back to the beginning of humanity, and what we have there is there's this Garden of Eden. There's two trees. There's the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the two trees represent, one represents life with God, and one represents life without God, life without his counsel. And so people have a choice, and the choice that we all make initially is the sin choice. That is that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is basically saying, hey, God, I'll do life my way instead of your way. And that's the essence of sin. I mean, sin is basically, the word actually literally means miss. And so it was a word that in the New Testament time, if you were shooting a bow and arrow, and then, you can't actually see what your arrow, whether or not you've hit the bullseye. But if you miss the bullseye, there would be somebody down near the target would say miss. Actually, what they would say is sin. And so you miss the bullseye. And so the Bible actually says that if you sin, you separate yourself from God, who's a holy God. And then the consequences of that is death, actually, and destruction for eternity and no relationship with God. So what we need is we need intervention on our part, and that Christ intervened by giving his life, and he shed his blood for the forgiveness of our sin. So sin is falling short of God's perfect standard. All of us do. Grace, the grace of Christ, the blood of Christ shed on the cross for the forgiveness of our sin. And that's what sin is, and that's how we respond to sin. And when I said earlier, Cedar Creek was all about helping people who don't know Christ. It's basically people who've sinned, which is everybody, and everybody needs Christ.
Amen to that.
I think that answered Bill's question.
Keep the questions coming. I'm loving it. Absolutely. No matter where you are listening or watching, simply leave your question in the comment, and Smooth Tim will get these questions over. We're talking to church coach and consultant Lee Powell. And Lee, I appreciate you taking the time to even be on the show again today. Your word it goes far with Smooth and myself, because we are Creekers, Cedar Creekers. And when you speak about, if only it could just be one, if you could bring in just one, our youth are our future. And I do want to state that Cedar Creek has a fantastic program for the little preschoolers as well as the teenagers. So I'll kind of someone else, some other group, some other church can kind of get an idea of just how to do it. I mean, what tactics did you use to attract and keep young people?
Yeah, so basically, if you want to, we'll use the word tactics or strategy. It's the same strategy that we used for people who are older as that we used to reach young people, which is really meet them where they're at, connect with them. What are they doing in their lives, and try to connect with that. In fact, that was Jesus' strategy, although he got criticized for it. In the Gospel of Luke, we read that it opens up by saying Jesus was actually hanging out and having dinner with, one translation says, with notorious sinners, people who were thought to be the not so good people in the community. And so here Jesus is having a meal with them, which was really not the religious thing to do at all. And so what happened is because he's meeting with these people, he's being criticized by the religious leaders. He tells three stories in response to their criticism of him meeting, and it's the story of the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the prodigal son, which are three powerful stories which illustrate in the Bible that God loves people. He's searching for people who are far from him and trying to bring them to himself. And when that happens, by the way, the Bible says at the end of the Gospel of Luke that there is more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than the 99 that already, sort of stay at the church. So God is really concerned. And so um, we would use strategies like reaching young people, or actually reaching the whole church. We used to say, we'll do anything short of sin to reach somebody with the gospel, which really is disturbing to some people. But an example of that might be that we one time ran this, so you could call it a campaign, where we had these coasters, and the coaster read on at happy hour, and then it had our service times, and there was a note that said, we think this should be the best hour of your week. Well, so we encouraged our people to hand those out. We had people so mad at us, but who do you think were the people that were mad at us? It was the religious people, the people from churches, not the unchurched. The unchurched thought it was funny
because you thought of it first.
Well, it wasn't so much that we thought of it first. It was really that they thought that it was like we were somehow joining in sin, by promoting happy, and that's ridiculous. And that's the same criticism Jesus got. And so we figured if we were being criticized like Jesus was, that was a good thing, not a bad thing.
Well, it helped, right?
Yes, yeah.
The church
And the other thing, though, is that not only did we do these things that we'll call them a little edgy, but also we were trying to be a church who had a reputation in the community for loving people. I mean, we had a single car carriage ministry, which they still have to this day, where they provide cars to single moms. Single moms are the demographic who are most likely to be in poverty. Repair their cars free. Actually, provide some cars free to some single moms. Not a whole lot, because you can't do that. We had a medical clinic during the week that was free. Feeding the poor. I mean,
and you do all of this because of what? Why? Why do you do all of this?
Because Jesus said, let your love shine before men, so so they'll see your good deeds, and really, I'm paraphrasing, but they'll love God as a result. It's amazing. When people see Christians behaving like Christians should, they somehow, it's like they credit God with that, which is what should happen. But I give an example of how this love in action, when it's on display, draws people to Christ. So there was a girl that I knew through Bob Evans. I used to sit at this restaurant, sit at a counter, and I'd read my Bible there. And she was a self-avowed atheist. And so, I love to have conversations with her, and we'd sort of try to understand each other. Well, one day I walk into the Bob Evans, I sit at the counter, and she says to me, I knew you'd do it. And I said, do what? And she got a little weepy. And Hurricane Katrina had just hit the week before. And so basically, she said, we responded by, we sent, I think, 5 semis. I don't want to exaggerate. I think it was 5 semis of supplies and $150,000 in relief. And we connected with a local church down there where we knew the pastor. Anyways, this made the front page of the Toledo Blade, the newspaper. And this gal, she just says, I knew your church would respond. I knew you guys would do something. She said, so I'm going to give it, I'm coming to church this weekend. So she came next weekend. And for the next 3 or 4 weeks, we would talk. Well, one day she said to me, I got a little problem. And I said, what's that? And she said, my son, his name was Ocean. He was going to the children's ministry, which you mentioned. Mm-hmm. And we encourage children, just as we encourage adults, to bring their friends. And so Ocean was not only bringing his friend to church, but he told his mom he wanted to be a missionary. So I said, right. Well, that's going to be a problem, isn't it, for an atheist to have a son who's a missionary? And so those kinds of stories of the love in actions, people seeing the love of our response to Hurricane Katrina. And it doesn't have to be something gigantic. It'd be, something very small, but people see that love, it awakens them, it does something, and it draws them to Christ.
Well, you know what? I want to speak on this, and I want you to elaborate on each one. There was an article called Church Answers with Tom Rainer. Have you heard of Tom Rainer?
Yeah, I do know who he is. Yes.
Okay, well, he shared a few reasons why some leave their local congregation. Now, when we talk about the church's role, that's why I started out by saying the church's role is within our congregation too, because they are our family too. And we
Sure.
go out and we help in the neighborhoods and outreach others, but sometimes it starts within. And these are some of the reasons, and you tell me what you think, or right or wrong or whatever. Someone said the pastor did not feed me.
Hmm.
That was a reason for
Well,
them leaving.
yeah.
I,
So
I
you want
got
to
more
respond to that?
if
Yeah.
you
So
want.
what I would say to that is, the pastor certainly does have a responsibility. The church has a responsibility to shepherd the flock. But remember, Jesus said there's more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than the 99 that stay behind. And so what happens is that pastors like myself, we hear from the Christians in the church more than anything else, feed me. That's what they say. Feed me, feed me, feed me. But here's the truth. Some people, they don't need another Bible study. They need to love somebody, reach somebody. And most of us are way educated well beyond our level of obedience, meaning that you and I, we don't obey what we already know, and we're going, feed me some more that I can disobey. Tell me more things that I can disobey. And I don't mean to be um, I'm not saying it's not important to feed the flock. It's critically important. But here's what, a lot of that feeding should lean itself towards sharing with them so that they're able to go out and share with others.
Okay.
You see,
So
you
that's
never, yeah, you never just stop. You never just say, hey, I've grown all I can grow. No, we should always be reaching out and trying to, help others grow.
okay. That's one reason someone wrote why they left their local church. Another one said, I stood and gave testimony and a plea for assistance, and it didn't come from my church home.
Yeah, well, that's too bad, and I'm sorry for that. And that's a I don't know what all the details were there, but that's a terrible witness. Yeah, so that for
Another
the
one
church
says,
walks on that one.
yeah. Another one says, I was out for 2 weeks and no one called me. You can relate to some of these things
Yeah,
that
and
people.
what I would say there is think about this. So there's 9,000 people at Cedar Creek, and then or just take a church of 500. The pastor doesn't know when somebody isn't there, but if that person was in a community group, if they were in a small group, that
They would
they're
know.
gonna
That's a
yeah.
good
And so
point.
that's why we used to say to people, if you don't get into a small group or if you're not serving in the church, you will not be missed. We
Small
used to
group
tell,
would be the same thing as Sunday school.
yeah, in a lot of churches it's Sunday school, exactly. But again, the point is there actually is some responsibility on my part to connect with the local body so that I am known. And if the church didn't call, I mean, if it's too, when somebody sees that a friend isn't there, what would you do? You would call that friend. So
Right.
you want to be in friendships and connected in community, or you
Well,
won't.
you and I
You,
weren't there. We don't know, but I can relate. We've all been around or heard or
yeah,
seen these things happen. And
sure.
this is something he said. He says, someone says, no one from my church. Wait, no, I did that one. Someone says, I asked my pastor to visit my cousin, and he
Yeah.
never did.
Yeah. Okay. So here again, here's what this person's saying is it's the pastor's role to go help my cousin. Well, actually, it's the pastor's role to equip others to go help his cousin. The pastor's role is clearly the Bible says, the equipping of the saints for the work of ministry. So the work of ministry is to be done by others. Not that pastors shouldn't visit people, but honestly, can you imagine if you have a church of 9,000, how would you visit people in the hospital? You couldn't, or
You'd
how are
be
you going to
walking
counsel
around with a
everybody? You
backpack.
can't.
That's what you'd be like.
Obviously, and the church in the New Testament, again, there were 3,000 added in one day, so it wasn't a tiny little church.
So
There were 3,000 people in the church
So
in
it's
one
important
community.
to have that organization, have those responsibilities,
Right.
Within the network, because hey, a church
Yeah.
is a business, nevertheless.
Well, it is a business in this regard. There are
Mhm.
fundamental principles that help a business to grow, leadership, structure, things like that. And so, in that sense, the church is yes.
Mhm. Mhm. Yes.
I have a question, Lee.
All right.
If you went back to having satellite groups that help bind the church family together, so to speak. How do you train those leaders?
Yeah, and so, well, during the pandemic, it's obviously via online, but
Mm-hmm.
even apart from the pandemic, that's a great way to do it, because they don't have to have another meeting where they leave their house. But yeah, and so what you've tapped into there, Tim, is again making disciples, equipping the saints for the work of ministry. That includes. You guys hear somebody crying in my office? That's my Doberman pinscher. And if
That's
he
all
keeps
right.
crying, can I let him out?
Yes, please.
I'm so sorry. Let
Yes,
me let my dog
go
out.
right ahead. We are having a
Here we go.
conversation with
Dog,
Lee
go.
Powell,
Okay, buddy. Go.
former
Go.
church. Oh, okay. Yes,
Oh,
yes.
sorry
Former
about that. Go
church
ahead.
leader.
I'm sorry. Crazy
That's
dog.
quite all right. I understand totally. You don't see our dog, but she's right by Tim, his foot. She's the nurse around here. She's keeping up with Smooth Tim. But Lee, what can churches do to help the community? See, when I say
Well,
community, I mean even those in the neighborhood. Because well, yeah. Tell me that.
yeah. So there's many ways, and one of the things I would say is, I would ask the pastor, so what's on your heart? What is it that you care about deeply? For example, one pastor in this community in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, he was adopted himself. And so you can imagine he had a soft spot in his heart for kids, that needed parents. And so he and his wife adopted children. And then it sort of they started doing it in their church where people started adopting. And when I visit his church, it's interesting. I look around and I'm like, there's a lot of different colors in this church. And there are and then you'll see, you might see black children with white parents and then Hispanic. And then you're like, what's going on in this church? Well, then you find out that they have a goal of making sure that in 2 counties, so it would be Tarrant County and I forget the other county, that there are no children who stay unadopted in an orphanage or in foster care. They want to make sure every child in these 2 counties
Wow.
is adopted. So my point about that is that's one way where they have this unique niche, and not that they don't do other things, they do. But man, isn't that cool that's, so that's what
Yeah,
I would
that's
do first
cool.
is I challenge churches to find, what's unique about you, what has God done in your heart? Just like, Silvy, that the things that have happened to you in your life are for a reason.
Right.
And the Bible actually says, the Apostle Paul says at one time, he talks about how the God of all comfort comforts us in our trouble so that we can comfort others. So those things for which we've gone through and dealt with, God probably wants us to help others, like that pastor, or I would say any church then. And then there are certain things that we're just going to do, like we're going to try to help feed the poor. If people are without, we're going to respond to those fundamental needs. Churches should.
Yeah. These are things that, I grew up with our neighborhood church helping I want to say hood, helping the hood, helping the ghetto, all of that on the real. There's always a church bus that came into the projects to get the little kids to go to church and things like that. But, right now is more than ever that we need to be done with fear and be up with faith. And we all need to really come together because there's evil on this earth right now. I'm not going to say names of who I think is evil. I'm just going to state the fact that there is evil on this earth. And, we people need to kind of stay together.
Need to recognize it.
Yeah. And so the church is a powerful entity that can keep us together and keep us in faith. And in doing so, I think that churches should, like you said, Bible school or engage with not Bible school, vacation Bible school. Do vacation Bible school or help clean the community, come together because, when it comes to the community, you don't just necessarily have to go to church to help the community and do something.
So, in Toledo, there was one pastor who I connected with, great friends, and it happens to be an African-American pastor that his church is actually reaching probably about 25% Caucasians and then about 75% minorities. But and he himself is an African-American pastor. But what we did at Cedar Creek, and they're still doing to this day, is came alongside of him because that's the community he lives in. And so we don't pretend to know the ins and outs of the community. But we said, hey, Pastor Calvin, can we come alongside of you? And how can we support you and serve you? Because we know the city, we're out in the suburbs, but we know the city it's part of our responsibility as well. Mm-hmm. And so we had a great relationship and still do. And there are a lot of those around the country where churches partner together where one with resources, and then they bring together their manpower. And I know that church, for example, some of the men from Cedar Creek and some other churches in the suburbs too get together with the men from that church, and they walk through neighborhoods at night.
That's good.
Yeah, and it's really cool. You're seeing these guys, white, black, arm in arm, not protesting, walking through the neighborhoods, basically saying, "Hey, you're not going to own these neighborhoods. These are crack houses and things like that." And so that kind of thing should go on. It's already going on, but it should go on even more.
Absolutely.
Hey, I have a question. Did you consider those demographics and everything else when you were planting other campuses?
Yeah. So, So people would say to us, "How did you decide a location?" I said, "Well, we're not like McDonald's, where we have millions of dollars where we can go, hey, we want to get this corner lot for our new building." Basically, for us, it was saying, "God, where are you calling us to?" And so we looked at the people who were attending the Perrysburg campus. And we looked at the zip codes and said, "Hey, there's a lot of people driving from this area. Why don't we, if we put a church there, they wouldn't have to drive and they could invite their friends and they'd be more willing to come to church."
Mm-hmm.
And so the second campus that we built was in Toledo, in West Toledo, which that's the demographic, that's the campus of all of them that has more minorities. And so what I say is churches should represent their communities.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody says, "Hey, why don't you have more black people in this church or more Hispanics in a church, let's say in the suburbs," you go, "Well, because there's nobody in the suburbs." No, basically, you should reflect your community. You absolutely should. And if you don't reflect your community, there's probably something wrong. But if your community has 15, 20% Latino, your church should be 15, 20% Latino. And that's how you critique whether or not you're doing well.
So I said 5 locations, and there's actually 6 locations now. Are we going to go for a 7?
I have no idea. They might, but it's interesting. The 6th location, the building from which, or the church from which we started Cedar Creek, that is now Cedar Creek property.
Oh.
That building that I left 25 years ago, they actually gave the keys to Cedar Creek a few years ago.
You mean the one in Perrysburg?
No, it's in Oregon, Ohio.
In Oregon.
When I said Oregon, Ohio, that's where so I came out of that church as the associate pastor and started the church, Cedar Creek in Perrysburg. That church I came out of in Oregon, Ohio is now a Cedar Creek location.
All right. Audience, do that again. That's great.
We call that a God thing, and you just can't explain it other than
right. Accept the blessings, and
God made it happen.
Yep. Accept the blessings and keep paying it forward. That's what I say. So during this COVID-19 pandemic, I've seen organizations and groups that help, like musicians in need with bills and things like that. But what about churches? When churches is in need and things, do they have organizations and places to help keep a church above ground and still functioning?
That's a great question. What I would say there is it's probably larger churches would be the most likely organization to help a smaller church. Churches aren't going to get help from the government, nor do I think they should, necessarily. I mean, I guess there are some cases where they perhaps should, but then the government controls what you say, and you don't want that. Mm-hmm. So I would say, if churches are in trouble, probably there's a reason, and it could be that maybe the community is just falling apart and people are leaving, and so it's no fault of the church or the leadership of the church. But if the churches are in decline and the community's not, church declining, community's not declining, community's even growing, there's something wrong at the core of that church, probably.
Right.
Leadership, and it's a leadership issue, sadly to say.
That's when they need you.
Well, yeah, or I probably I can be of more benefit to a church that's doing well than a church that's doing poorly, probably, because generally speaking, when churches are doing poorly, it's a leadership issue, and it's very hard to change a leadership issue. Meaning, if a leader comes to me and says, "Man, my church isn't, I'm really stuck and I've got all these problems," half the time he's the problem.
I was going to ask you that. Have you been someone call onto you and you come in and the very one that's calling into you
Yes.
is the culprit.
Oh, yeah.
And you have no problem saying it's you.
Well, yeah. And so I don't.
You
I,
know,
I'm
just
not
like,
going to say that I say it quite that direct, but I went into one church one time, and I knew it was one of the worst experiences in terms of a sermon. It was terrible. But what was interesting is the guy was successful in other areas of his life, but nobody had ever told him, And so I just had a conversation with him when I said, maybe God hasn't called you to ministry. Maybe God has called you to business to help churches,
mm,
because your preaching is not good. It's not helping anybody. And
Mhm.
so he's still preaching,
is he
and,
really?
and his church is stuck. Yeah.
See, well, I mean, you get some that just don't want to accept it, you know,
Yes. Yeah.
especially if you're going to come through the door and not in my words, but in your words, say you're the problem. They're not even, chances are going to even leave. They're going to just, they probably knew it was them all along. Come on.
Yeah. There are some that have actually, I've helped in that they've said, I realized that this isn't a role for me. Some have realized maybe they didn't need to be the lead pastor and they needed to be an associate pastor somewhere. They had a heart for the church, but they'd just been sort of elevated to a place of incompetence, so to speak.
So you see, you say you like working with churches that's already doing good and help them do further. But
Yeah,
right
well,
now,
I like,
all of them are hurting in some way right now.
yeah. So I loved it. Either church, either is good for me, and so I don't mean to, but here's the thing: if I come to a church and they say, "Hey, we're out of space," man, I love that problem. See what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
That's not a that's it's like coming to it's like counseling somebody who comes to you and says, "I'm really depressed." I can help that person, but it's like really draining. Whereas if somebody comes to me and says, "Man, I feel called of God, and I want to do ministry," and they're all excited in their life, that person, see, my ministry tends to lean more towards that, to helping success on top of success.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas that other person, maybe they need somebody to listen to them for a while, and I'm not the best at that,
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately. So
So, but well, if someone has any questions or they want to request your services right now, because
yeah.
this is a time where I think that that market shouldn't be hurt at that much as a store trying to get customers. Churches need coaching and consulting to
Yeah.
even for themselves keep the faith and keep
And a
going with
different
that
point of
purpose.
view.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and what's interesting now is the whole all those the coaches out there, and there's a number of them out there that help churches. It's changed, and it's changed because of COVID-19. Because now the coaching isn't around, events that emanate out of a building, for example, or making the weekend service better. It has to do with online, and
Mm-hmm.
so I may not be an expert about online matters, but I know people who are. I do know this. I know that we have to have presence, and so online gives us that presence. And so, but so it's changed. The coaching has really changed, and um, there are some churches right now that because of finances, they're struggling, and
Mm-hmm.
so they can't afford maybe to have a coach.
Mm-hmm.
And that's and in my case, especially locally here, I'll go have a cup of coffee with somebody, multiple times. I'm not going to charge them anything for that. I mean, that's fine. And then if they decide they want to do some consulting down the road, that'd be great. But it's a whole different world out there. Because the consulting wraps itself around, do we have services or do we not? And we're all new to this, so it's not
Mm-hmm.
like I'm an expert can say, man, I've had 20 years of dealing with pandemics.
Right.
So,
Well, I don't want to have 20 years experience dealing with
oh
this. I hope
no.
it's done. But how can someone get in contact with you if they do have questions, concerns,
Yeah.
or want to request your services?
So here, after saying all that, I don't have a website. For me, it's just relationships. And so I have an email, which is clydeleepowell@gmail.com. That's my full name, Clyde Lee Powell at gmail.com, or my phone number is 817-807-3438. That's 817-807-3438. People can call me and we'll talk, chat. And so I do consulting mostly locally. So I don't have to travel as much
Mm-hmm.
because of the pandemic. But I also was doing a lot around the United States for about 2 years there. I was traveling extensively.
That's great. We need your services around here. We really do. And I did mention, by the way, Cedar Creek. And if I'm not mistaken, that's www.cedarcreek.tv.
That's correct. Yes.
And get yourself some. Because Cedar Creek, when I first went to Cedar Creek for the very first time, when I was dating Smooth Tim. I walked into a whole new thing about churches. It was amazing. The welcoming at the door. That was my first time being in a church and hearing music that was comforting. You know what I'm saying,
Yeah,
Lee.
yeah,
You provided the services with the times. You stayed up with the times where. Am I saying that correct, Smooth?
Yeah.
It did. It blew me. It blew me away.
The
And,
environment was welcoming in many aspects.
yeah.
So we try to have a familiar environment. Like the building in Perrysburg looks like a theater.
Yes.
So it's a familiar, it looks already a little different than a church. And then you walk in and you see a big sign and it says free soda. Instead of us asking you for something, we were giving something. And then you come in and to the auditorium at all the campuses and you hear music that's music you'll hear on the radio, secular music. I'll just say it.
Mm-hmm.
Not secular music that's filled with sexual innuendo and all that, but something that people can connect with. Like sometimes we play a classic rock song. We might do a Led Zeppelin song, or I mean something like that.
Right. Right.
Or very current songs. But the idea was to connect with people where people would go, they'd go, oh, I'm familiar with that. Because most people that haven't been to church in a while or haven't been to church all their life, which there's a lot of them, they walk into church. It's a very foreign environment, very foreign, because people are singing and doing things they don't do anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
You don't turn the radio on and hear hymns. And so we tried to connect with people, and we got criticized for that. And to this day, I was just there for the 25-year anniversary. Ben gave a fantastic talk about this very thing, about why Cedar Creek still to this day uses music, modern secular music. And by the way, the whole service isn't that way, as you know. We play one song that was maybe a modern secular song, and then it goes from there to worship choruses and faith in Jesus. So the service always moves from connecting with where you're at in life to who Jesus is and why you need him.
That's
and
right.
how to grow in faith in him. Which
That's
is
right.
the strategy for not just Cedar Creek. That's really, I think, Jesus' strategy. That's how he did life.
Well, that's
He
right.
connected with people where they
No
were at.
one said that you could worship and sing songs to just only an organ.
That's exactly right.
You know?
It's funny, if you go back into history, the organ just barely snuck its way into the church. That there was actually a church council vote at one time, and the organ was voted in by a thin margin. It was considered to be this secular instrument, that was like had demons coming out of it or something.
Well, we've come a long ways from there. And again, it's cedarcreek.tv to get some great music, worship, and wording from there. Lee, I thank you for taking the time being on the show. Is there anything that you want to add?
No, I would just say, one of the, just for people to keep the faith. And, like you said, it shouldn't be about fear, but about faith, and love God and move towards God.
Absolutely. Well, listen, I look forward to having you on again. I thank you for taking the time and being on the show today. And if anyone needs words, questions, or even about faith, contact Lee Powell.
Lee Powell at gmail.com.
There you go. All right, Lee, I thank you. I want you to go out and continue this beautiful day. Have a terrific Tuesday. We will definitely be in touch with you. And I thank you for being on the show today.
Thanks, Elder Tim. Thanks, you guys. Love you guys. Take care.
You too.
You have a good day. That was Lee Powell, everyone.
Wasn't that nice?
Yes, it was. One other thing that I wanted to mention about what churches in the community, you go out and plant some trees or help people plant a garden, show the talent within the congregation. There's a lot of things to collaborate, bring unity within the community. And you like that unity
assistance. Any type of assistance you can provide to your fellow man is doing the right thing.
I'm telling you, this is times right now where you need to be gone with that hate thing and love your neighbor, love your family. Call someone today and just say, hey, I was just calling to say how you doing.
Yeah, you and I seem to work things out. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, make someone smile, make someone's day, do something kind and great. In fact, spread the word for the Queen Silvy Show, because coming up on part 2, we have Tobias J. Cook. He's also known as Morning Star. He's a producer, rapper, engineer that's going to be on showcasing some of his music and chitty-chatting with Queen and Smooth. So spread the word for part 2 coming up. We're going to close out part 1, and we will be back in just a moment.
See you in
But
a bit.
until then,